think it's probably a good time to get started. So happy Wednesday, everyone, and happy December. And welcome to the last webinar in the Dataverse in Canada series, talking about leveraging an open data repository for research data stewardship. This series focuses on introducing the Dataverse repository and institutional services available for use in Canada today. We're showcasing a diverse set of presentations related to current use cases and models, including an open discussion panel, which we had 2 weeks ago, and best practice guidance related to data curation for ensuring and enhancing the fairness of your data. My name is Jennifer Abel, and I am the training coordinator for the Alliance RDM team. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging today that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you would like to put your own land acknowledgement into the chat, please feel welcome to do so. In today's presentation, we are going to be talking about data best practices for Dataverse, about new guides to help curators, data managers, and stewards. The Dataverse platform provides data curation and metadata documentation opportunities to repository managers of all backgrounds and skill levels. Understanding how to curate a data set and describe it according to Dataverse's metadata standards and requirements can improve the end user's discovery, access, and use of the data itself. These new guides from 2 Portage working groups will help new and experienced curators and repository managers standardize their curation and metadata practices in the Dataverse environment. Before we get started in earnest, a couple of housekeeping notes for you. You will note that you've automatically been muted when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including security updates. But if it does ask you to update in the middle of the session, maybe wait until afterwards so you can stay until the end. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or if you have additional resources to share. Please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. You may also raise your hand if you wish to ask a question. And questions may be asked in English or in French. A reminder that today we do have simultaneous interpretation available, which you can access using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. We do have a code of conduct that we follow here. The Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform, and the Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form. Harassment is understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment. So please play nicely while you're here with us today. We have 4 presenters who are going to be sharing with you today. Michael Steelworthy from Wilfrid Laurier University, where he is the data librarian and coordinator of research data services. Eve Petkat-Pigra from the University of Montreal, Université de Montréal. Elle est bibliothécaire en gestion des données de recherche. Teresa Bastic, also from Université de Montréal, où elle est bibliothécaire métadonnées. Mark Goodwin from the University of British Columbia, where he is the geospatial metadata coordinator. And now, Michael, the virtual and pixelated floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Just give me 1 second here to move on up, as we say. I'm going to start first. Thank you, everyone. I want to acknowledge that Laurier, my university, and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract. This is the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict. Of note here, from the Haldimand Treaty of 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of the river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The treaty was signed by the British and their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution, and despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, these nations now reside on less than 5% of the original territory after losing much of the territory to the settlement of newcomers. Thank you for being here. Apologies if a little one stomps in. My 6-year-old has a cold, and so it's a little interesting day today for me. Anyway, let's get on with things. And the things we're going to be talking about today are the new Dataverse Curation Guide and the new version 3 of the Dataverse Metadata Best Practices Guide. We're going to start with the Dataverse Curation Guide, why there was a need for it, how it works, challenges we faced in producing the guide, and producing the guide in French and in English, and next steps for the guide itself. After that, we're going to speak about the Dataverse Metadata Guide. I'm going to give an overview of the version history and of the content of the guide itself, and issues and challenges related to French metadata handling in Dataverse. Okay, so the Dataverse Curation Guide, here we go. I want to acknowledge right off the top the hard work of the working group who developed this guide. These are the colleagues who are part of the working group. They've all put a lot of time and effort into developing this curation resource. Ev and I are speaking on their behalf today, but there was this whole cadre of people. Without them, this work would never have finished and the guide would never have been produced. So thank you to everyone whose names are on here. And if you see them in the chats, give them a hello. Here are the links to the guides. You will find them showing up in the chat, and the links to the metadata guides will be posted during Mark and Teresa's talk in a few short minutes too. So let's start by addressing the need for this curation guide in the first place. Why exactly did we create one? Well, as we all know, there are very, very few how-to resource guides for curation. Sorry, I'm just playing with my screen here because I can't read all my notes. There are very few guides, how-to guides for curation, let alone for curation resources for Dataverse. And there are fewer resources that are fully bilingual between English and French. Add to this the fact that we all work at organizations that have different priorities, there are different sizes, different resource capabilities, and you can see that the lack of curation resources represents a significant gap that needs to be addressed. So in spring of 2020, the Alliance RDM Curation Expert Group convened our working group to provide guidance in French and in English for marking up and curating data sets in Dataverse. Our marching orders were to create a guide that's tailored for Dataverse in the Canadian context, to be adaptable to different service models, to promote consistency in curation practices, and to work for curators who are working themselves at different levels of experience and expertise. So you can say here we are in March 2020, staring down this resource gap. There has been this growing imperative for improved, consistent curation practices in Dataverse, but there are very few paths to take us there from point A to point B to point C. And that's where our working group fits in, to quite literally bridge that gap for Canadian curators and to help them get from point A to point B to point C, regardless of their level of ability, regardless of the service capabilities or service priorities of the organizations in which they work. So our work within the working group began with an environmental scan of curation practices and workflows, both inside and outside of Canada, inside and beyond Canada, and including Dataverse. So we started by asking this community that we see on this call today, what sort of workflows do you have for curation practices within Dataverse? We extended that out to Dataverses outside of Canada. We looked at Dataverses and curation guides for Dataverse curation guides for Dataverse and curation guides in general. What we found was that there were a lot of deposit guidance documentation, but not so much when it comes to actual curation itself. We decided through the course of this environmental scan that the best possible course to adapt or to go forward was to adapt what's called the curated framework developed by the Data Curation Network in the United States. This framework outlines the various steps and practices that are required to curate research data. Our job within the working group was to adapt it to meet the needs of Canada's Dataverse curators in both official languages. And my colleague Ev will spend a few moments later on discussing some of those translation challenges that we had in moving from the acronym curated to the acronym curation, as well as other things. Now, you will find that the curation guide, if you've downloaded it, you may have seen this already. If you haven't downloaded, I invite you to download it right now, basically. You'll find that the curation guide is flexible enough or should be flexible enough to meet the needs of your organization. The guide acknowledges that there are different service scenarios for your organization to adapt. You may offer a fully mediated white glove curation service, or you may be at an institution that is offering a completely unmediated service, completely open. Or like most of us, you're probably somewhere in between in that semi-mediated curation scenario situation. Similarly, the guide also acknowledges that the level or the kind or the amount of curation that you undertake on a data set may be different from a colleague at a different institution, or that level of curation that you undertake on that data set may differ from one data set to another within your repository for whatever those reasons may be. That level of curation you do is dependent on your time, it's dependent on your knowledge, it's dependent on your own resource capabilities, let alone whatever your service scenario is. You may be a well-seasoned, fully experienced curator, but you're working at a small institution and you are wearing many, many hats. And so you may not be able to use all the skills that you have within the course of your daily work because you have so much work to do. Or, you know, there are different scenarios and different situations where these things intersect. As my colleague Alex Cooper puts it, and she actually wrote this in an email to the CanLib mailing list last night, and I really liked it. The level of curation, that curation service that you provide is going to be dependent on what your service can actually sustain. But if we consider that level of curation that we offer using these thresholds that you see here, minimum requirements to make data findable, the ability to enhance discoverability and ensure usability, or level 3, preparing the data set for reproducibility and preservation. If we consider the level of curation using these thresholds, or using them as starting points for yourself, then we may be able to build in some consistency into our practices over time across organizations. So how is this all going to work? And I promise I am going to show you the curation guide. Keep in mind that that kind of curation service you have, or service scenario that you have, mediated, semi-mediated, so on and so forth, and the level of curation that you offer, they're not going to map perfectly. There are dependencies like the type of data you're working with, your expertise, the demands on your time, your institutional policies, your institutional priorities. The guide you're going to find is going to provide advice and instruction on how to curate data based on the service that you're providing. So hopefully the guide is going to be able to work for you or be adaptable to work for you. If you're at a small institution, you should be able to make this guide work for you the way that you are at a medium-sized institution or a large-sized institution, or whatever those priorities and FTEs may mean for you. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is probably Alex Cooper's most favorite slide, and so I really want to make sure that it gets into the deck. Data curation is not a linear process. Our guide uses an acronym, curation, as a rubric, and sometimes we talk about steps of curation, but data curation does not follow a straight line. There are moments when you are going to double back on a process to revise or refine your work, or to take in new knowledge that you have found either from the depositor or the researcher or what have you. And that means that it's not, as I was kind of suggesting before, point A to point B to point C. It can be a little topsy-turvy. You may find yourself going up to get down or going left to get right. And eventually you are going to get to where you need to go, with apologies to Umberto Eco and The Name of the Rose. But you are going to find yourself in situations like this where you're not too sure which direction you need to go, or you kind of know which direction you need to go. It's just not going to be that straight line. You will eventually get that object, that research data curated, but please don't think that it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's often feedback loops that are baked into our practice of curation. So now finally, here's the guide. If we could put the guide into one slide, this is it. This is what the curation guide is based on, this acronym of the word curation. Each letter in the word curation corresponds to a curation action to take and the processes that happen in those actions. So the first step is the check step, and there are processes required to check your data, or check the data that has come to you for curation, and then understand the data. You will have under R, that's the moment where you begin recommending improvements back to the depositor or the researcher, augmenting the data, data transformation if you have file formatting considerations. I is including persistent IDs, resource or reusing license agreements. We have optimization principles, mostly for fairness. And one of the most important steps, even though it's at the very end, is N, note down your curation activities for sure. So you can see already with the letter R right there, this is where one of those feedback loops come into play. If we recommend improvements and those improvements are made and they come back to us, that's the feedback loop. We may have to recheck, and it may happen a couple times before it gets done properly. So that's one of those moments right there. Within the next 5 minutes, I'm going to highlight the C and U parts to give you a sense of how the curation guide looks. I encourage you to download the resource and explore further. The resource itself is available in PDF and in Word format, so you can adapt it to your local institution. Now, here we are. This is step one of the curation guide, where you quite literally check the data set. This is the first step, and these are some of the first things you will likely be doing if a data set is deposited with you. These are all level 1 considerations. How to make something, the minimum requirements to make something findable. So, and these are the questions that you find in the curation guide. Has the data set been submitted to the appropriate Dataverse, to the appropriate collection? Are the required metadata fields complete? Are they accurate? Has the depositor agreed to a terms of use, if you have a terms of use? In many cases, this may be like asking the question, is this good enough to be findable? It's a little kind of fuzzy around the corners. Is it good enough to be findable? But this concept of perfection being the enemy of good, if you need to make something findable, these are the questions that you are probably going to be considering right off the bat. This slide here is quite literally what the curation guide looks like. You can see that it's broken down into checkboxes. Yes, no, some issues not applicable. And the questions that I was posing here on this slide are basically taken from these rows on here. The main curation guide is broken down in this way, so you can go through every step, check, understand, recommend, so on and so forth, and go through these processes one by one and determine, yes, this is done. No, it's not done. Oh, there are some issues, I need to return to it. Here is step U, or step 2, which is step U, which is understand. Step U is intrinsically linked to step 1, check. It's where the level 2 and level 3 steps come into play. So we have this case here where, remember, level 2, where now we're asking questions for, is the supporting documentation thorough and accurate and complete? Do the files open properly? Are contents appearing as expected? Remember, with level 2, we're thinking, how do we enhance for discovery, enhance for usability? Are files and folders named and structured appropriately? With level 3, this is where we're moving towards a concept of helping to prepare something for preservation, potentially for reproducibility. So you would see in the understand section questions like, if there is code, is that code well documented? Does the code produce the expected results? If there are questions about submissions with potential sensitivities, you see them here too. Now, a reminder, we've just in 2 minutes or less talked about level 1, level 2, and level 3. A reminder that the guide does not expect you to operate at level 3. You may not have the capacity to operate with code. That's okay. We are not suggesting that you have to. That's going to be an organizational concern that you need you will have probably determined already. You may be operating at level 1, level 2, level 3, some mix of them all. My point here is that we don't expect you to be writing code within the curation guide. But let's say you are proficient with R and you have an R project that comes your way. Well, that would be a level 3 process. And if your organization is working at a level 3 process, then this is when it comes into play, given those time and resourcing and capability that is available to you. A quick note here on how the curation guide handles questions about sensitive data. The working group spent a lot of time on this subject. Given the special care required to handle data with sensitivities and those jurisdictional and organizational regulations that differ from one jurisdiction, one place to another, it was tricky to give guidance on this subject that would be applicable coast to coast. To be clear, the Dataverse platform is not a sensitive data enclave. The manner in which you handle sensitive data is likely going to be based on your local organization's capabilities that are related to, yet still external to Dataverse. So I mean technical capabilities, but also soft systems, your research office, your REB, the collaborations you have with your campus IT and your indigeneity office, so on and so forth. In short, the guide acknowledges care and feeding of sensitive data is required, but it's dependent on many local resources. It may be that future versions of the guide will return to this subject and go on in further, but we want to make sure here that we made clear so everyone understands that Dataverse, remember, is not a sensitive data enclave, and you are probably going to have to look out beyond Dataverse when it comes to that. Real quick, moments here to show you what the guide looks like when you download it. I showed you a clip of what the main guide looks like. This here is a quick reference guide. We have packaged alongside the guide these quick reference guides that show you the primary steps, the primary tasks that are associated with each letter. Downloadable, you can adapt it in Word, you can print it off, and it's much smaller. I think it's only 3 or 4 pages, depending on whether it's English or French, as opposed to working with a 20-page document. So we expect that people will be using these quick reference guides day in, day out, should they want to be using the curation guide. They are all part of the same package, whether you're downloading the English or the French. And so it's up to you which one to choose, but we found in our conversations and feedback that this is, we expect that this is going to be well received. Some companion guides. Our guide doesn't operate in a vacuum. The guide does acknowledge that there is out in the wild and with us today, the metadata best practices guide. In this case here, for direction and advice on metadata, the guide recommends that you head to the metadata best practice guide. This is where, part and parcel where you're going to find all the metadata. And it also works alongside the Dataverse guide from Scholars Portal, which does a great job on how to deposit. And for advanced information, we call out to the Harvard guide. And we also recommend that people check out the DCN's curated workflow, which was the original that we came from, as well as the Harvard guide as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ev to talk about language challenges.
Merci, Michael. Donc, oui, dans notre travail sur ce guide, ce qui a été vraiment intéressant, c'est dès le début, on s'est entendu pour tenter le bilinguisme par design, donc d'intégrer le bilinguisme au processus de développement de ce guide-là. Pour pas que ce soit, pour pas que la traduction arrive à la fin comme, comme la vaisselle après une soirée si agréable, et que ce soit plutôt quelque chose qui soit plus naturel dans notre travail. Donc, des défis liés à la langue auxquels on a été confrontés, le travail supplémentaire pour les personnes qui sont bilingues, parce qu'il y a un désir d'engagement de la communauté autour de la curation de données. Donc, la rétroaction pour les outils qui sont en développement est importante, mais les outils pour les personnes bilingues, il y a 2 outils. Il y a 2 fois les outils sur lesquels faire une rétroaction. Aussi, il y avait toute la question de l'acronyme. Donc, trouver un acronyme bilingue pour éviter comment dirais-je, d'augmenter la charge mentale des francophones qui doivent, en plus de devoir réviser plusieurs guides, doivent apprendre une multitude d'acronymes pour comprendre le contenu de ces guides-là. Aussi, évidemment, les ressources entièrement bilingues là, sont vraiment difficiles à trouver. Puis je dirais les ressources en français, parfois aussi, sont difficiles à trouver. Puis au niveau de la traduction, c'est sûr qu'il y a des enjeux de vocabulaire, surtout pour un sujet aussi technique et à la fine pointe de plusieurs développements. Donc, à ce niveau-là, on peut avoir aussi des enjeux. Puis l'idée, c'est vraiment que la différence linguistique mène, comme je disais, à une charge mentale qui est plus grande, mais l'idée, c'est comment, malgré tout, limiter cette charge-là pour optimiser la performance des personnes qui ne sont pas nécessairement anglophones ou dont la connaissance de l'anglais peut être limitée. Puis, ce qui est vraiment intéressant aussi, c'est que ce contexte multilingue-là est commun, pas seulement au Canada, mais quand on pense d'une manière qui est internationale, l'Union européenne, il y a plus d'une vingtaine de langues officielles, donc de développer des processus pour être capable de collaborer efficacement dans un contexte qui est bilingue ou multilingue, c'est vraiment intéressant. C'est certainement une contribution que le Canada peut offrir en ce qui concerne la gestion des données de recherche, là, puis d'autres domaines aussi, évidemment. Merci pour avoir changé de diapositive. Donc, je reviens un peu sur l'acronyme curation. on avait vraiment le désir de trouver des solutions pratiques pour faciliter la discussion entre les différents acteurs avec différents backgrounds culturels au Canada. Donc, ça a été de traduire, le premier pas, ça a été de traduire l'acronyme en anglais, puis aussi d'adapter en fait cet acronyme-là, curation, qui est une adaptation d'un acronyme qui a été développé aux États-Unis par le Digital Curation Network. À l'origine, c'était curated, donc accordé à la manière de nos amis américains. Puis, ce qu'on a, oui, c'était vraiment important. Ça a amené bon, il y avait des lettres de plus, il y avait des choses de plus à réfléchir, mais je pense que des obstacles peuvent amener à la créativité. Donc, ça a permis vraiment de réfléchir à ce qui pouvait être amélioré dans cet outil qui était déjà très, très, très intéressant. Entre autres, je souligne par exemple à la lettre I, on a eu l'idée de suggérer d'inclure les licences et les ententes de réutilisation. C'est vraiment quelque chose qui est important quand on parle de curation de données. Donc, ça a été intéressant pour ça. Puis ça nous a permis vraiment de réfléchir pour vraiment apporter, comprendre, puis apporter un plus à l'ensemble des étapes de la curation en cherchant d'abord une solution pour accommoder un contexte un peu différent que le contexte américain. Donc, la prochaine, next slide. Merci. Donc, Michael va vous parler un peu plus des prochaines étapes. Et moi, je vous souligne quand même le désir de créer une ressource en ligne qui est interactive, parce qu'on a vraiment le désir de créer une communauté de pratique en curation de données qui est bilingue et puis qui accueille vraiment l'ensemble de nos collègues canadiens et peut-être même des collègues un peu plus hors les frontières canadiennes. Donc, voilà. Merci.
Thanks, Ev. Yeah, so next steps real quick. You can see them here. I'm going to rhyme them off super quick as well. We want to adapt the guide on feedback as the guide is used in practice. So expect to see, in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, asks out to the community, how does the guide working for you? How is it not working for you? Are there room for improvement? Do you want to help contribute on that? Something that's very important to us is to find more French exemplars and find more resources vis-a-vis curation that are actually in French. And this is a stumbling block that we are trying hard to overcome. We want to add more templates for correspondence that between the curator and the depositor. And there's some concepts and ideas for movement on that. And what Ev had mentioned about a dynamic web-based resource, this is something that's on our mind in the agenda, and we'll see where this goes, but we want to take the content that now is shown to you in document form and turn it into a web-based resource. Make it easier to navigate, easier to adapt locally, easier to update. There won't be necessarily version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, but just iterative version changes to make a quick update as required. And we are thinking right now about a broader workshop on curating data using the guide, so going through all the steps of the guide. And so keep your eyes out on the mailing list that you found the links to for this. Maybe you'll see this in the new year. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Teresa and Mark. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Michael. I want to start by saying thank you to Jennifer for the introduction and also the land acknowledgement. I'm located in the same region as Jennifer and would like to also acknowledge the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people where I live and work. So I'll be talking about the Dataverse North Metadata Best Practices Guide, and then Teresa's going to follow up with some French language considerations. So first of all, a big thank you and shout out to past and present members that have worked as part of the Dataverse North Metadata Working Group. So this group has produced all the versions of this guide. The individuals listed here are authors on version 3, and there have been others in the past that have been part of this group that have contributed to previous versions. So thank you to all those people. Like the curation guide, the metadata guide is available in both English and French. I believe someone's going to put those links in the chat. Yes, thank you, Jen. So I'll start with an overview of the guide. As Michael mentioned, it does act as a kind of companion guide to the curation guide. And it also can be used on its own as kind of a reference guide for Dataverse metadata. It provides direction to both the novice and experienced user in creating metadata for datasets in a Dataverse repository. Included in the guide is a general introduction that outlines how the guide's organized and how to use it. And then also the Dataverse software is, the metadata in the Dataverse software is broken into different blocks that are specific to different topics. And the guide is organized in a similar way. Different sections address different metadata blocks, and that's where you'll find the guidance for each individual metadata field. This slide is illustrating the version history of the guide. So it's been through several versions. We started out with version 1, which was just covering general citation metadata. And then with each subsequent version, more metadata has been added, more metadata coverage has been added until now we've arrived at version 3, which is a big milestone for us because it now features comprehensive coverage of all metadata fields in Dataverse. So the guide is organized to align with those 6 metadata blocks available in the Dataverse software, as I mentioned. I'll go through those blocks now. So there is the citation metadata block. This is the core metadata required to publish a data set, basically just general citation information. And then there are 4 subject-specific blocks. So the geospatial metadata block is metadata that describes spatial extent, for example, location information of data in the data set. This one's we've treated a little bit differently than some of the other subject-specific blocks, as it is encouraged for any data that is associated with a location. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, geography data. We think that using this metadata block is useful regardless of the subject area if the data itself is associated with a location. Then there's the social science and humanities metadata block, the astronomy and astrophysics and life sciences metadata blocks, fairly self-explanatory. These blocks have fields that are appropriate for the associated subjects. And then finally, there's a journal metadata block, which is a little bit different. It's specific to the journal format. And this is used by journals that are using Dataverse as a data repository. So the fields in that block identify journal volume, issue, article type information that the data set is associated with. So the guide begins with an introduction that outlines how it's organized and how to use it. And then following that are these metadata block sections. So each block section in the guide begins by summarizing information specific to the metadata block. And then you get the table, which is where all the metadata fields are described in the block according to a few different headings we've used. You can see them on the slide, and I'll just go through each one. So field, that's simply the name of the field as it appears in the Dataverse interface. And then we've got description with tips. So in this column in the table, you're going to find a definition as it's provided in the Dataverse software itself. So if you're in Dataverse software, you can see this definition by hovering over the field name. And then also tips and notes that have been added by the authors. So we've included these to help users better understand the field, its definition, or its usage. And then there's a usage column, which is suggestions based on best practices that indicate whether a field is required, recommended, or optional. There's a repeatable column, which is an indicator that lets users know whether or not a field can be repeated. For example, if there are multiple authors, that's a field that is repeatable in Dataverse. And then finally, an example column. So for each metadata block, examples have been included to place each field in context. And based on the availability of existing data sets, there is a little bit of variance between the nature of the examples we use, in that some are real existing data sets and some are fictitious. Just depended on whether we could find existing data sets that fully illustrated the guidance we were trying to get across. So here we have a screenshot of the citation metadata block table. You can see the fields, you can see the columns I mentioned here. So there's the fields, definition with tips. The tips are, you can see the definition is provided first, and then tips are in italics. Recommended usage, and whether the field is repeatable, and then examples. And I think we can take a look at this in French as well. So same thing here. Now in each section, so we provided individual examples for each field in the tables, and then there's also an actual examples section following the table. So this is where we've actually broken things down a little further, and we've taken a look at what the metadata is going to look like when you input it. So you've got the edit view, and also once it's been published in the public view. We did experience, want to highlight some issues and challenges we experienced to just pass on that knowledge. So balancing compliance with DDI in the Dataverse template was a bit of a challenge. The DDI metadata standard is used heavily as a source for the Dataverse software metadata, but it's not exactly the same. It's been customized a bit. So trying to kind of reconcile that, what could be challenging at times. We've had to use a number of English examples in the French version just because there wasn't enough availability there. Translation also presented some challenges, and Teresa's going to get into some of the French language considerations and issues that we encountered in just a moment here. Finally, the time to put together a document of this scope with very dedicated, but also members who are volunteers. So that's, everyone was very committed to doing this. Okay, I'll pass it over to Teresa now.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Marc. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci pour votre présence aujourd'hui. Moi, pour ma part, je tiens d'abord à souligner que le terre sur lequel je me trouve, donc le campus de l'Université de Montréal, fait partie du territoire traditionnel qui a servi comme lieu de rencontre, d'échange entre plusieurs peuples autochtones, bien avant l'arrivée de Français. Et les sujets que je voulais aborder aujourd'hui pour compléter et conclure la présentation de mes collègues, c'est vraiment la question de la langue des métadonnées dans Dataverse. Je vais tout simplement faire part de nos réflexions, nos discussions, mais aussi présenter quelques pistes de solutions pour la création des métadonnées en français plus spécifiquement. D'abord, pour vraiment bien placer cette réflexion, je rappelle le contexte, donc le projet d'internationalisation de la plateforme, le projet qui était mené entre autres par mes collègues de l'Université de Montréal, grâce auquel, depuis la publication de la version 4.10 de la plateforme depuis janvier 2019, notre communauté bénéficie vraiment d'une interface bilingue. Donc, on a cette fonctionnalité qui nous permet de basculer entre le français et l'anglais. Mais le problème, c'est que nous avons en fait aucune instruction sur le choix de la langue de métadonnées à saisir dans cette interface qui se présente comme bilingue. Je précise par ailleurs, juste pour vraiment clarifier mon propos, c'est que la langue des métadonnées n'est pas nécessairement la même que la langue de données, donc la langue de contenu comme telle. Donc, a priori, en déposant un ensemble de données, on est vraiment devant un choix. On doit choisir la langue pour les métadonnées descriptives et a priori, en fait, on est confronté à ces dilemmes linguistiques, peu importe la langue de notre contenu. Donc, la recommandation que nous avons formulée dans les guides, en fait, elle se veut vraiment pragmatique. Donc, nous recommandons que la langue des métadonnées soit la même que la langue du public cible. Bon, le public cible lui-même est parfois difficile à déterminer, à cerner, mais on pense que c'est vraiment les déposants, donc le responsable de données qui devrait pouvoir le déterminer. Et bien évidemment, cette recommandation de choisir la langue du public cible pour les métadonnées vise à maximiser, à optimiser la découvrabilité et donc favoriser le respect du principe FAIR. Cette optimisation de la découvrabilité est donc en fait la solution pour nos dilemmes linguistiques auxquels on est confronté. Elle dépend largement du type de métadonnées qu'on saisit. Le schéma des métadonnées Dataverse est complexe. D'ailleurs, ceci explique 56 pages de guide de bonne pratique. Je pense que ça nous justifie. Mais nous avons essentiellement en fait 3 types de métadonnées descriptives. Donc, d'abord, il existe quelques identifiants pérennes. Donc, par exemple, la possibilité de saisir leur guide pour identifier le créateur. Les identifiants sont une solution parfaite à bien des égards, mais notamment parce que, en fait, la question de la langue des métadonnées ne se pose pas, tout simplement. La découvrabilité dans différents environnements linguistiques est assurée. Donc, espérons que le développement de la plateforme, en fait, poursuit cette direction. Mais en attendant, nous avons également 2 autres catégories de métadonnées un peu plus problématiques, comme les métadonnées provenant d'un vocabulaire contrôlé, en fait, pour lesquelles l'utilisation d'un vocabulaire contrôlé est recommandée, comme par exemple le champ classification par sujet. Et enfin, nous avons les métadonnées purement textuelles, donc de simples chaînes de caractères, en fait, comme par exemple le champ titre ou description. Là, je vais dire juste quelques mots sur la prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Next slide, Michael. Thanks. Donc, quelques mots sur le métadonnées provenant d'un vocabulaire contrôlé. Il se divise en fait grossièrement en deux catégories. La première, ce sont les métadonnées pour lesquelles on peut choisir un vocabulaire spécifique et en plus, on peut l'identifier dans les sous-champs, dans les sous-éléments. Voici comme exemple que j'illustre ici, c'est l'élément classification par sujet avec les sous-éléments vocabulaire et URL du vocabulaire. Donc, dans ces cas, en fait, en précisant, en identifiant le vocabulaire spécifique, on spécifie implicitement sa langue. Donc, je dirais que la solution, les solutions pour nos dilemmes linguistiques sont faciles à identifier. Donc, en fait, la solution anglaise que nous recommandons dans les guides pour qualifier le sujet des données, c'est le vocabulaire FAST. En fait, ce vocabulaire nous a semblé autant plus adéquat qu'il existe un équivalent français. C'est le vocabulaire RVM FAST. D'ailleurs, je profite de l'occasion pour saluer le travail exceptionnel de mes collègues de l'Université Laval qui maintiennent ce vocabulaire qui, à mon sens, est vraiment un excellent outil pour augmenter la découvrabilité dans un contexte francophone. La prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Merci. La deuxième catégorie de métadonnées provenant d'un vocabulaire contrôlé, ce sont les champs en fait, nécessitant un vocabulaire spécifique unilingue qui est vraiment suggéré par les instructions de Dataverse. Par exemple, les vocabulaires contrôlés DDI, qui sont requis pour certains métadonnées en sciences sociales. Mais ces vocabulaires, en fait, ils existent en anglais uniquement. Donc, en fait, aucune solution française n'est disponible. Donc, dans ces cas, nous avons donc un choix, soit d'opter pour ces vocabulaires et de saisir ces valeurs en anglais comme telles, ou bien d'essayer de les franciser, de les traduire en français, et donc de les considérer comme des simples éléments textuels. Dans ces cas, en fait, c'est qu'il faut évaluer, anticiper, je dirais. C'est vraiment l'exploitation future de ces métadonnées. Je vais rappeler tout simplement qu'un des avantages de la plateforme Dataverse, c'est son potentiel d'interopérabilité des métadonnées grâce au schéma de correspondance qui ont été établis notamment avec le schéma DDI. Donc, bien évidemment, dans cette perspective, si on veut vraiment prioriser l'interopérabilité et profiter de ces potentiels de la plateforme, c'est vraiment la conformité avec ces vocabulaires qu'il faut maintenir en fait. Et enfin, la troisième catégorie, next slide, please. Merci. En fait, c'est ça. La troisième et dernière catégorie de métadonnées, ce sont les champs textuels. Donc, le problème que nous avons identifié ici, c'est le fait qu'en fait, il est impossible de spécifier, de qualifier la langue de ces métadonnées. Donc, il n'y a pas de possibilité d'inclure un attribut pour identifier la langue de ces éléments textuels. Donc, on n'a pas de possibilité de préciser, par exemple, voici le titre en anglais, voici le titre en français. Donc, la solution, ou bien, encore une fois, c'est plus un conseil pragmatique pour optimiser la découvrabilité, c'est vraiment profiter de la richesse du schéma des métadonnées et d'utiliser, par exemple, le champ titre alternatif pour le titre traduit. Donc, par exemple, les titres en français, si le titre principal est en anglais. Et en plus, en fait, on peut dupliquer certains champs, certains éléments, comme classification par sujet, description, pour saisir les valeurs dans les deux langues. Et donc, ce sont des éléments répétables, je les souligne. Donc, en gros, en fait, soyons généreux. Voilà, c'est le conseil. Ça peut se résumer ainsi. Donc, en fait, ceci conclut la partie un peu théorique de ma présentation. Et pour terminer, je vais ajouter... next slide, please. Oui, pour conclure, je vais ajouter quelques mots sur les prochaines étapes pour notre groupe de travail. Donc, il y a un projet qui se dessine à l'horizon avec Harvard Dataverse pour soutenir la révision des métadonnées de la plateforme. C'est un gros chantier qui s'amorce. En plus, bien évidemment, on a l'intention de bonifier les guides, donc ajouter plus d'exemples, plus de conseils, aussi vraiment préciser certaines instructions. Et enfin, bien évidemment, on va tenir à jour les guides et maintenir sa conformité avec le développement de la plateforme Dataverse. Donc voilà, je laisse la parole à mon collègue Marc.
Thank you, Teresa. So I'm just going to, I'll reiterate that next step slide first. Thanks, Michael. And then I'll close it out here. So this is just touching on next steps for our Dataverse North Metadata Working Group. Harvard Dataverse is currently undergoing a review of the Dataverse software metadata, starting with the Citation Metadata block. So they've reached out to, through the Alliance, they've reached out to the working group to help support them in that work. So that's currently what we're looking to work on in the next few months. We've also we're still planning to work on the best practices guide, the metadata guide, and still give it some improvements. This could be more examples, you know, if we can find more French examples, more tips for the different fields. There were we kind of had a list of nice to have items that we set aside because we really wanted to push out version 3. So that's something we think we can still expand on the guide a little bit in that way. And then also updating the best practices guide to be consistent with the Dataverse software, any changes that happen there, especially in light of the review they're doing. So that's something we'll be looking out for as well. And to close things out, we'll open up the question period now, but if anyone has any lingering comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us listed here. We've put our emails on this slide, and I'll close by saying thank you to everyone for listening.
And I will just pick up by saying that I will be sending out the slides to everyone who registered probably tomorrow, along with the link to the video. So you will have the email addresses for our presenters today in those slides. And thank you very much to all of our presenters, to Mike and Ev and Mark and Teresa. That was a wonderful short but deep tour into the worlds of curation and metadata and the guides for them. We have a few minutes available to us for questions, and I'm going to go to something that's come up in the chat a couple of times, which is the relationship between these curation activities and data management plans, or DMPs. And I'm wondering if someone would be able to speak to that a little bit.
I guess I'll take that.
Okay.
If other people want to interrupt, that's cool too. The relationship of these guides to DMPs, I would say the curation guide and the metadata guide, because having been a part of both working groups, I think that these things really should be thought of as, you know, two complementary things, two best friends. The data management plan is something that is developed by the PI, by the research team, often in concert with, or hopefully in concert with, some people who understand DM or RDM. So how the curation guide and the metadata best practices guide is injected into the DMP is, you know, it may not always be a direct route, and I don't know if it would always be, you know, present time and time again, because the DMP is focused on the practices, the planned practices and activities of the research group itself, and the data that's going to come out of that. But at the same time, I think that if a research body, a research group, an individual, a team, whatever it might be, is thinking about data description, is thinking about a knowledge mobilization and how their research outcomes are going to be made more usable, preserved, made discoverable, made interoperable, made reproducible over time. Having an understanding of curation and curation practices, and having that somehow, like I said before, kind of like injected into the document, would be a benefit to the DMP, and not just a benefit to the DMP, does it make it a good document, but be a benefit to that research team, so that in that cycle down the line, or even within the active research phase, the curation does begin, you know, when the research begins, or even prior to the beginning of research. I will say these guides are built with Dataverse in mind, especially the curation guide. It's not necessarily tied to Dataverse, and so there are real practices and principles that can be found elsewhere. And in terms of the metadata guide, Mark and Teresa, you know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there are still, if you are working with a repository that works with DDI, for instance, or ISO 19115, having an understanding of how these fields are designed long ago, in some cases for like print material, and interact with research, you know, digitally born research data, can have a significant effect on how, or should have a significant positive effect on how that data is collected, stored, administered, et cetera, et cetera.
Great, thanks. Just going through the questions here and seeing what we can get to in the time we have available to us. Question en français. Qu'entendez-vous par révision des métadonnées? Ev ou Teresa?
dirais que je peux essayer de répondre. En fait, j'ai peut-être besoin de plus de contexte, en fait, peut-être contextualiser cette question, mais j'imagine qu'il peut s'agir de révision des métadonnées soumises par les déposants qui soumettent un ensemble de données dans Dataverse.
Nous avons une réponse dans les QA.
I can also,
Yep. Oui.
I can also take a stab at that. I think that question came in with Mark's comment about the next step for the metadata guide is working with Harvard, who are doing a metadata review. So what they're doing, what Harvard is doing for the main Dataverse is reviewing all the metadata fields, I believe, to make sure they're properly described, all the information that's needed is there. But also they're looking at what are the problems when someone is filling in the metadata, what are the problems in that then being displayed or in being used? Because for those of you who have used Dataverse quite a bit, you will notice that some fields you can add HTML code into, some you cannot. Some fields are repeatable, some are not. So that's part of the metadata review of looking at which fields should be repeatable. Are there what can they add to the code to make it even more usable? So it's very much a behind the scenes kind of review. I hope that answers the question.
Oui, merci Alex, merci pour cette précision. Je pense que j'ai mal compris le contexte de la question. Merci.
That's great. Thanks so much. We'll go with one more question and then we'll wrap things up for today. My understanding is that Dataverse can help deposit data used to publish research to enable assessment and reproduction. If this is the case, the data may not be in raw format. Is the curation process still needed in this case?
Yes. We're done. Yeah, it would. We are. We would argue that curation and curation practice is required regardless of the kind or the status, the QA/QC status of the research data that has been deposited, whether you're working with a generalist repository or a subject-specific repository. The point of curation is to enable or to enrich access, use, interoperability. If the data is not raw, a lot of that has happened already. But to make the data work with the platforms that it is, or to make the data work best with the platform which is holding, which means making it work with all the platforms so it can be found and stored and preserved, there is a curation element for sure. And so I would invite the person who asked that question to maybe like talk to any of us or talk to some of the curators that they know to think about what kind of curation will still happen when we're looking at process data.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. And seeing that we are at the top of the hour, I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. We also have no further questions, so it's an excellent place to wrap up. So once again, thank you so much to all of our presenters today, Michael Steelworthy, Eve Paquet-Brigras, Mark Goodwin, Teresa Bastic, to Alex Cooper and Aaron Clary, who joined us as well for support, to Anthony, our wonderful interpreter. Merci encore, Anthony. And thank you to all of you for joining us. This has been our last webinar of 2021. And this has actually been my last webinar as the training coordinator for the Alliance RDM team. I will be moving on to the University of Calgary on Monday, virtually, not in person yet. But I will still be in the community. So I will see you all around the virtual RDM community and hopefully at some point in person as well. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your 2021, and we'll see you sooner than later.